Let's turn, however, to your recent article just published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, in which you make an argument about cultic practice, the centrality or importance of cultic practice to the Qur'an, and how that the cultic dimension sort of unlocks the meaning of Deen, Islam, and Hanif. And so I propose we sort of go through these one at a time, if that's okay. And we start with this Arabic word Deen. And so, some of our viewers may not speak or know Arabic, so important to say that Deen in modern standard Arabic usually means religion. So if you're having a conversation today with an Arabic speaker, it would be probably taken for granted that Deen means religion. This is also one of the two meanings that is generally assigned to the word Deen in the Quran. But there's another as well, which I'll let you introduce, like in the phrase Yom Adin. So yeah, can we start with Adin? Could you explain those two meanings? I think there's also two etymologies, different etymologies for those who would see an earlier history of the word before it enters into Quranic Arabic. And yeah, how, before entering to your reinterpretation, how the standard view of this term works out.
Absolutely. I think you really put it well. There's really oftentimes scholars posit two separate kind of clusters of meaning, as I call them, for the term Deen. One has to do with judgment and maybe a punishment and requiting, and it's shared with other Semitic languages as well. And in the construct Yawmuddin, the day of judgment or the day of recompense, which appears in those passages for the most part that are considered kind of early or middle Meccan. I know we may not kind of want to uphold the chronology, but it's been noted by some people that there's that.
But famously in Al-Fatiha, right?
Exactly, Fatiha Maliki Yawmiddin.
Yeah.
Exactly, the king or maybe the possessor of the Yawmuddin. And in Hebrew also we have analog Yom Hadin, or in Syriac we have. And then there is the meaning, the other meaning, which is oftentimes translated as religion, sometimes as faith, and it is seen to be a term that applies to basically the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, maybe as a whole in the Quran, and later on maybe applied to some other teachings that we call religions, other systems, broad systems of maybe belief and ritual and law and ethics and so on. And it's sometimes suggested that this meaning is not really a Semitic meaning. It comes from Middle Persian, because in Middle Persian there's also a term Dain or Daina in Avestan, if I'm not mistaken, originally. And so that is seen to refer to a expansive conception of belief combined with ritual and law, which then is very close to our modern concept of religion. So people have hypothesized that. I think the earliest I've seen is Alois Sprenger in like 1861. In a footnote, he says, "I think this may be a Persian influence," and then it's developed later on. I think Sprenger is like the most important scholar of Islam and the Quran, even though it is not recognized. A lot of ideas go back to him from the 19th century.
In terms of later Orientalists drawing on
exactly,
he had initially.
Exactly, from the 19th century. I think he was very influential. So so that is the kind of common way of looking at it. And what I don't know if I should kind of get into that part of what I argue, or would you want us to kind of...
Yeah, so if I could just comment a bit on the way you develop or advance the conversation in regard to Deen. I mean, as I understand from the article, I mean, the common notion, the one potentially, and I know you've sort of questioned this a bit, but potentially connected to this Middle Persian term. So the notion of the complete teachings of the Prophet, I mean, at least part of that complete teaching is sort of doctrine. So sort of acceptance of certain doctrines about God and God's relationship to the world, including to humans. And you sort of want to orient our understanding of the term more towards practice. Maybe I'm oversimplifying, But you have a couple of strategies for showing this, and we'll get to some of the key Quranic verses in a moment. But you argued that there are also pre-Islamic, potentially pre-Islamic poetic and other, for example, Kitab al-Asnam, the famous Islamic work about pre-Islamic practice,
Right.
which show that when early Muslims and pre-Islamic Arabs were using this word, they often meant something to do with a cult, some sort of practice. So anyway, yeah, could you maybe take it from there?
Exactly. So I think, yes, I think when deen has been discussed, there's oftentimes an emphasis on the doctrinal aspect or the emotional aspect of deen as I think one common way in which in the Arabic exegetical tradition, the Islamic exegetical tradition, deen in the sense of religion is understood with reference to early Arabic usage. They say deen in Arabic meant ta'ah, it meant obedience. And so maybe it grew from obedience to become religion. And Izutsu has a very good chapter on this in which he basically makes the same argument that the exegetes have made, that deen maybe started as a personal faith and obedience, and then it accumulated other dimensions and practical dimensions, and then it basically became religion as it's understood, as the manifestation of obedience to God. And so what I have, so the way I see it is, I feel that Izutsu was very close. It's like he had a key and he was very close. And the exegetical tradition also had a key, very close to kind of opening the door. But some of the cuts of the key were not accurate. So here's what I think kind of unlocks the door and brings everything into focus. And, everything makes sense to me, at least, is that I think deen in early Arabic, in early poetry, and also prose texts, it really means service and servitude. That's the kind of fundamental meaning. We have, Imr al-Qais has this poem that I found in the course of my research. He's bragging that, people used to be our slaves. كانوا عبيدا, they were slaves, وَكُنَّا نَحْنُ أَرْبَابًا, and we were masters, and then maybe we have lost our dominion for now, but we will come back to reclaim it. And then he says, we will reclaim it حَتَّى تَدِينُوا لَنَا, until you serve us, or be our subjects, or be subservient to us, طَوْعًا وَإِتْعَابًا, with willingness, and or maybe with resistance and in hardship and in toil, but you will come back tadinu lana, to serve us, basically. So that's and there are many other examples that I could find. And there's this sense of deen is something that you render to a king. A king. What are people to kings? They're subjects of the king. They're servants of the king. The king possesses everyone. To the king belongs everyone in its dominion, basically. And so others owe the duty of serving the king. Din al-Malik. So there is this in Arabic. When I sent an article to Michael Lecker, he pointed out to me that there is this concept of laqah in Arabic. Some people who were not under the dominion of kings, and they were very proud of that. They resisted the authority and subjugation to the kings. And they were, there are different ways in which it is described in the sources. They la yadinuna lil muluk. They do not serve the kings, or lam yakunu fi din al malik. They were not in the service of the king, or in thrall to a king. And so I felt that actually, and when you look at the some of the works of lexicography, actually they mentioned that very explicitly. So in Jawhari's Sihah, Jawhari was a scholar, died in the late 4th century, I believe. So he, says danahu means ista'badahu. Danahu means he took him as a slave, basically. And then from that he mentions al-madin, which means a slave, and al-madina means a female slave. So it seems that it was a productive root in Arabic, that from which they also built nouns. And deen means kind of servitude. But this idea of deen as ta'a, I think, has kind of messed up and kind of derailed the conversation. Because if we come back and recognize that the basic meaning is really servitude, not obedience as such, then it is actually the same thing that is in the Quran in both a non-religious and a religious context. For a non-religious context, when I was reading Surah Joseph, there's this phrase that it was not for Joseph to take his brother fi din al-malik, except that God willed it. And this is usually understood as in the king's law. So maybe Joseph did something against the king's law, but God kind of willed it and he managed to do it. But when we look at that whole metaphor of the kings and resisting the dinul muluk, and it seems to me that no, Joseph actually took his brother as a servant to the court, basically. That's what he did. Fi din al-malik, as the servant to the king. And the previous verse, in the previous verse, Joseph asks, before it's revealed that it's in Benjamin's bag that the kind of cup is found, Joseph asks, well, what should we do to the thief? And then they say, he himself will be the recompense. فَهُوَ جَزَاؤُهُ. Take him, basically. So it's not, we're not going to pay you any money or, to let us go. You can just have the person who stole this as a slave, basically. So fi din al-malik makes perfect sense in the context. And
he would be a servant, right?
Exactly. He'll be a servant. And I think the same idea of service and worship in a religious context, it means worship. I would say worship is the same as service. Makes perfect sense of almost all, I would say, Quranic usages of deen in the Quran. And so when the Quran says, deenillah, I don't think it's talking about a reified system out there and a religion, as we would call it. It's talking about the worship of God. And it's saying, basically, that phrase appears in the context of kind of polemic against Christians and the idea that they are serving Christ. And it's saying, why do they want to serve something other than, why are they after the worship of after something other than the worship of God? Right?
So in obvious, if I jump in, sorry if I'm interrupting you, but I just see a clear connection to a very famous use of the word deen in Surah Al-Ma'idah, right at the beginning in verse 3.
Exactly.
الْيَوْمَ أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينَكُمْ.
Exactly.
And then it later goes on to say that I've been pleased with Islam. So, sorry, first to translate for those who may not do Arabic. Today I have, well, maybe you'll correct the translation, but usually translates completed for you your deen. And then it goes on and say, I've been pleased with, and now we get into another term, which you discussed, with Islam as your deen. So you would see that connected to maybe some of the cultic things that are going on at the beginning of Surah Al-Ma'idah.
Exactly. So I'm glad you mentioned the cultic aspect. So all this thing about, service and worship, and for us, maybe worship is sometimes just recognizing the reality of God, or having the correct emotional disposition. Maybe sometimes prayer, silent prayer is worship. Maybe sometimes also communal prayer is worship. But it seems to me that in the Quranic context, when we say worship, when the Quran says worship, when the Quran uses the word abada, la a'budu ma ta'budun, I do not serve what you serve, and we translate as serve or worship. Lakum dinukum walidin. You have your deen, I have my deen. That in the Quran, it seems to me that this worship was not just, if I may use this, lip service, meaning the service of our lips and, just kind of silent prayer. It was actually actual actions that people did in order to demonstrate their commitment and their devotion to Allah, or maybe to some other beings, to kind of maybe please some other beings, or, to curry favor with them.
Yes.
And so it seems to me that in the Quranic context, deen oftentimes has a very embodied notion of worship. It evokes a very embodied notion of worship, which is easy for us to kind of miss, because we have our own system of worship. We don't go to a sanctuary oftentimes, but the Quran was revealed in Mecca, was given to the Prophet preached the Quran in Mecca, where there was a sanctuary, and this was a dominant presence apparently in people's lives.
That's a really important point. Just if I can underline that. So you mean in the lives of Muslims around the world today, for example, there's ritual prayer and then congregational prayer on Fridays. And so it's the Salah, which sort of marks the practice in some ways, along with, other questions of purity and things. But if you're living right around the sanctuary in Mecca, you're attentive to all of the rites that would be taking place there.
Exactly, absolutely. So I think this universalization of Islam has led inevitably to the Meccan sanctuary becoming a less significant and pervasive presence to later Muslims than it was to the earliest Muslims. I think in the earliest kind of surahs of the Quran, there is this atmosphere of there is this sanctuary. It's really important. The Quran talks about it. It says that you owe your safety to the sanctuary. People make pacts by this sanctuary. They go to pilgrimage to the sanctuary. They sacrifice animals by this sanctuary, and that's an important form of worship that kind of becomes, I think, less important as time goes on. And the prayer, even when we call prayer, it's a very kind of physical act. Like salat is a very physical act that people do. I mean, it has some verbal things to it, but there's also this physical demonstration of your kind of servitude to God and so on. So all those rituals, which are called cultic rituals, because there's that sanctuary that is the center of attention. I think when the Quran talks about, uses the word ibadah or deen, oftentimes these evoke the rituals of worship that are associated with the Meccan sanctuary. And the Prophet and his followers were really different from the mushrikun because, at least from the Quranic standpoint, the Prophet and his followers only devoted their acts of worship to Allah, one God. They recognize him. So there's the intellectual dimension. They recognize him only as the only kind of divine power.
Yes.
They also devoted their acts of worship only to Allah, whereas the mushrikun, by the Quran's telling, at least, I know there's this other debate that we have to be cognizant of whether the mushrikun were really polytheists, but by the Quran's telling, they at least sought the pleasure of some other beings. They called on some other beings. Maybe they offered maybe agricultural and animal offerings to other beings. Maybe
presumably in addition to Allah. And
exactly,
not
in addition.
Of Allah, but in addition.
Exactly, in addition to Allah, maybe to seek their intercession with Allah. And so I think a lot of the polemic in the Meccan surahs of the Quran is really about this cultic difference of, you call on them. And again, calling on for us maybe is just kind of silent prayer and so on, or maybe personal prayer. But I think it may actually sometimes have distinct rituals behind it. And so what is the difference between them? The Quran in Surah Zumar, I think, is one of the good examples. Say, "Qul Allah a'budu." I only serve Allah. Mukhlisan lahu dini. And I think here it means that I dedicate my worship only to him. So akhlasa, in the sense of making it exclusive to him. It's not I make my religion to him per se. It's that my worship I only dedicate.
The mukhlis there is sometimes associated with the notion of sincerity.
Exactly.
But that's not what you're going for here. No, it's
exactly.
It's exclusivity.
Exactly. I think it's the exclusivity of worship, and sincerity can become an aspect of that. But I think in the Quran, especially in conversations with Meccans, what's really key is this idea that we do not worship any being other than Allah. And so that's really the paramount importance. But think about it, for the early Muslims living in Mecca, there is this competition with the mushrikun who seem to be calling maybe on some other people, maybe on some other beings. That is very significant. But for later Muslims, that is not significant. For them, ikhlas, if it means only calling on Allah, that's what everybody else is doing. It doesn't have any special significance. So ikhlas as sincerity kind of takes over. But actually, if we look at the works of exegesis, we see that sometimes even well into the 6th and 7th centuries, maybe even later works of exegesis, still the notion of sincerity exists side by side with that exclusivity of worship.
Yes.
I think it overtakes it, but so I would say initially maybe exclusivity of worship is the dominant concern, and then sincerity is maybe a side concern, but then they change places and sincerity becomes really the main meaning. I mean, the Quran says, when you are on a ship and there is this, the waves rise,
everyone calls
on God, mukhlisina lahuddin.
Yes.
It's not talking about sincerity. It's saying they're afraid now, and so they maybe pray to him, maybe they offer him sacrifice, maybe they throw someone overboard as a sacrifice, but they're doing an actual thing and they're
Yes.
only calling on God. But when they get to the shore and they're like, okay, so we will use
Yeah.
other means as well to
Go
secure.
back to our partners, or I think maybe even shayateen is called at one point.
Exactly, or
Yeah.
maybe it was the
Yeah.
jinn, as the Surah
Yeah.
Al-An'am kind of seems to suggest. So in any case,
Yeah.
the argument, and I think Islam, if I may go to Islam, because I think it's really kind of
Connected. Yeah.
intimately tied
Mhm.
to this, that even
Yes.
Islam, in many contexts, I would say, I don't want to say in all contexts, but it seems to me that in most contexts, if not all, it is also about this exclusivity of worship. It is not